Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to be taking a look at Nozick and Bentham on the issue of value and reality. So we've got our topic here again, value and reality. I've added one more question here. Must experiences be veridical to be valuable? When something's veridical, it accurately reflects reality, it coincides with reality, corresponds to reality. So when an experience is veridical, what we're experiencing is really the way it seems to be to us. If an experience is not veridical, it's a hallucination or it's an illusion or something like that, then our experience is not really showing us what is real. So our two authors for today, we've got two short readings to start with and then a couple longer readings for the next couple of days. Jeremy Bentham was a 18th into 19th century English philosopher, social reformer, legal and political reformer as well, advocated for the expansion of education to more and more people in society. So he was very influential person, very, very involved in the politics of his day and social matters. He's, in a lot of ways, really best known these days, I think, for his codification of utilitarianism, which is a moral theory, and we're really going to see the basis of utilitarianism in the reading here, which is that right and wrong and good and bad are really determined by pleasure and pain. So Bentham was an advocate of really a secular theory of morality and a secular way of approaching questions of what we should do. Now, I'm going to include here another little biographical bit. Remember, I'm giving you the biographical bits just as context. I don't really ever want to hear about them in essays or anything like that because they're not really, probably not relevant for establishing your thesis in those cases. But there's something about Bentham that just I feel utterly compelled to share, which is that after Bentham died, he had himself stuffed. He turned himself into an auto icon. And he is still on display at University College London in London, England. Bentham helped found University College London, and so he wanted to be on display there. And so they kind of tucked him in a corner somewhere. I haven't actually seen him myself, but I think sometimes he's taken off display and everything. So it's actually his clothes in the sort of closet display case that they have him in. It's his clothes. It's actually his skeleton under there, and he's been stuffed in a way. It's a wax head because the head turned out kind of funny, so they've tucked it off in a, I don't know, closet or storage area of some sort. But that's just a fun fact that really doesn't bear on anything else I'm going to talk about. But I just love it. It's just too good. So something you might want to look up and read about a little bit more if you're just like, what? I keep saying I want to do the same thing, but I don't think my wife wants me to. All right. So getting into the actual reading. So an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. I asked you to read just chapter 1 on the principle of utility, which is really all I gave you in addition to the glossary and the preface and everything in there. So what do we see in here? Well, Bentham argues that pain and pleasure are really the two determinants of our action and of morality. So we'll explain what that means. And then argues that actions are right or wrong, both for individuals and for the community at large, insofar as they increase pleasure and decrease pain. And that's really it. So it's the principle of utility that we need to use as our single sort of measuring rod of value. And while he doesn't quite come out and say it in this piece, he really tacitly endorses the view that only mental states matter. That really, it doesn't matter whether or not mental states are veridical, whether or not they're showing us the way reality actually is. Really all that matters is whether or not they're pleasurable rather than painful. So let's just get to it and see what he's got to tell us. So Bentham is a psychological hedonist. Psychological hedonism is the view that we're motivated solely by pleasure and pain. So hedonism is really a view or some kind of variety view that really all that matters is pleasure or pain, or has something to do with, pleasure and pain being really important. Psychological hedonism, or being a psychological hedonist, is the particular variation of that view that's dealing with our motivations. So what actually motivates us? Pleasure and pain, and anticipated pleasure and pain. And that's really it. All right, so if you wanted to try to point to something else as a way of trying to refute that, what Bentham would try to do in response would be to show you that really what you're interested in is pleasure and pain of a certain sort. So if you said, oh, look, I'm not, I'm going to do a particular action, or I'm motivated to do a particular action because I think, other people thinking I'm a good person or a truthful person or something like that. And it's not because the action itself is pleasurable. Bentham would respond and say, right, but you derive pleasure from the thought that other people think you're a good person or whatever it might be. So really all you're motivated by are pleasure and pain. Now he's also an ethical hedonist. So not only does he think that all we're motivated by are pleasure and pain, but he also thinks that pleasure and pain are really the only things that determine what is good and bad. So good and bad attached to people or states of affairs, and then actions are generally right or wrong. So we see actions as right or wrong, or they can also be neutral if they just have nothing to do with morality or anything like that. So an action is right if it promotes pleasure, produces pleasure. They're wrong if they reduce pleasure overall, and it's overall pleasure, not just the individual, but for everybody involved, the community at large. States of affairs are good when they're pleasurable, they're bad when they're not. People are good when they promote the production of pleasure, and they're bad when they don't do that. So really, right near the outset of the chapter, Bentham tells us all of this in a nutshell. He tells us nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other side, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, and all we say, and all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. So, this, really, in a nutshell, this is how to understand Bentham's view. Right? We're motivated by pain and pleasure, and it's only pain and pleasure that really determine the moral status of an action or a state of affairs. Right? There is no standard of value independent of concerns of pain and pleasure. Now this gets us to his principle of utility. And this is really at the heart of that moral theory utilitarianism. If you've done some more philosophy or moral theory, you've probably run across it before. Often we study John Stuart Mill, which was Bentham's most famous pupil or disciple, who really took utilitarianism in the mid and later 19th century and formulated it into a more codified doctrine and helped popularize it even more. But Bentham is really the founder and the coiner of it. So this principle of utility, I've got part up here, but I want to read a little bit more. Bentham tells us by principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. I say for every action whatsoever, and therefore not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. He goes on. By utility is meant that property in any object, whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. All this, in the present case, comes to the same thing. Or, what comes to the same thing again, to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. If that party be the community in general, then the happiness of the community. If a particular individual, then the happiness of that individual. So this is really what we get, right? The principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle, Bentham says that's another thing we can call it, that might seem a little bit more obvious, especially to us these days. Talking about the principle of utility, it's it can seem almost a little off-putting. But again, you've just got to think in technical terms. What does he mean? Well, utility is really this property in an object whereby it tends to produce happiness or prevent unhappiness. Right? So if something prevents us from being unhappy or prevents pain or produces pleasure or makes us happy, right? And again, Bentham thinks of happiness and unhappiness just in terms of pain and pleasure. Then an object has utility, right? Actions are right insofar as they promote happiness or pleasure. They're wrong insofar as they don't do that. They do the opposite, right? They actually promote pain, right? Or reduce pleasure. And we can think in individual terms, we can think in communal terms, so we can apply it in different sorts of ways. And Bentham thinks we can take this principle of utility and apply it not only to moral matters, questions of individual action, what should I do, what should you do in various situations, but we can also apply it to legislation, laws, the governance of entire communities. Now, Bentham doesn't quite come out and say this, but pain and pleasure are really mental states, right? Something can't be painful if you don't feel it, right? Something can't be pleasurable unless you feel it, right? To say that something was very pleasurable but you had no sensation of pleasure is I think, basically incoherent, right? That was very enjoyable. I slept through the whole thing, right? That was a great movie. I fell right asleep at the title and just, woke up at the end. It was lovely. And of course, in a sense, sleep or not having consciousness can actually be quite lovely, at least when it allows us a reprieve from, worries and pains and different things like that. So, and that's not really any kind of counterexample to Bentham. He would say, of course, well, look, if your conscious experience is unpleasurable, right? It's, you're worried or, you're in pain somehow, you got a toothache or something, and then you go to sleep and you have no experience at all. It's better to have no experience than painful experience. But of course, it's better to have pleasurable experience rather than no experience, or especially rather than painful experiences. So really, standing behind Bentham's view seems to be this tacit endorsement of the view that it's really only mental states that matter, right? It's our pleasurable mental states that are good things. It's our painful mental states that are bad things. But if it's only mental states that matter, and so now I'm trying to dig into Bentham a little bit more and go in some ways well beyond what he himself was saying, or perhaps even had in mind. Bentham was a prolific writer, so I'm not sure if he engaged in any kind of science fiction scenarios, though he's really writing before science fiction is really even a genre. But nevertheless, he might have thought about bizarre cases and things like that. But if it's only the mental states that matter, right, and they're being pleasurable or painful that really matter when we're thinking in terms of value, then their causes don't matter, right? Now, that seems to lead us to, or really paired with this, a pleasurable non-veridical experience, right? A pleasurable experience we have, mental, being in a mental state that does not accurately reflect reality, is, I've put in here morally, though we might want to think about this in sort of non-moral terms, but we're really thinking about questions of value here, right? What's really valuable? What should we do? Given that Bentham is really committed to pleasure being the good thing and pain being the bad thing, he doesn't have any room here for having, the knowledge matter itself, knowledge be valuable in and of itself, having true beliefs or veridical experiences, having some kind of value independent of their being pleasurable or painful. So a pleasurable non-veridical experience is morally better than a painful or even less pleasurable veridical experience, right? So what Bentham is really, seems to be committed to, if we put to him, if we think about our films here, right? Think about Cypher in the Matrix. Should he plug back in, right? Of course, Trinity thinks he's making a mistake, and other throughout the film, there's this running sort of sense, right? Reality matters. You gotta have the truth, right? Of course, Cypher explicitly rejects that. No, that doesn't matter. What really matters is pleasure and avoiding pain. being in the real world, or what he takes to be the real world, is less pleasurable than being in the Matrix. So he wants to go back in the Matrix. Not only that, he doesn't want to know that he's in the Matrix. Why? Because that itself would almost certainly undercut the pleasure he would experience of being in there. Insofar as Bentham is concerned, barring some way of cooking up a utilitarian justification that actually points to pleasure and pain, and you know, Cypher's choice causing more pain for him than pleasure, Bentham would say, well, Cypher does the right thing. Right? If it's actually more pleasurable to be in the Matrix than out of it, then we should plug in. But of course, part of what's going on with what Cypher does is that he, at least seems to be, selling out humanity in order to make, to attain more pleasurable experiences for himself. Now, Bentham would say there is an issue there, because Bentham himself wasn't an egoist. He doesn't think that all that matters is the individual. He thinks that the community at large, right, everybody matters. So overall happiness matters. But of course, there's still a utilitarian question there. If Cypher plugs back into the Matrix and gives away the keys to Zion, and you know, the machine's going to wipe out the resistance, and then everybody else is plugged into the Matrix, does that, on the whole and over time, produce more pleasure or pain than if Cypher didn't do that and kept, you know, fighting the resistance, et cetera, et cetera? Given that when people come out of the Matrix, it seems like their lives are less pleasurable than when they're in the Matrix, it seems like the answer is probably no, that's not actually a good thing. It's not a good thing to have that human rebellion. Unless somehow in the long run, that human rebellion would, you know, claim victory over the machines and then lead to a world that was more pleasurable than being in the Matrix in the first place. So this is the way that the utilitarian would think about it. We think about, say, Ready Player One. You know, I noted that at the end of the film, they just sort of slip in there this little, you know, oh, you know, only reality is real. Only reality, in some sense, really matters, or it matters more than a virtual reality like the Oasis. And so people should spend more time in reality and less time in the Oasis. Right? For Bentham, you know, what's the calculation there? Well, what causes more pleasure? If being in the Oasis, you know, as much as possible, is what produces the most pleasure, then that's what we should let people do. In fact, that's just the right thing to do. There's no standard of value you can appeal to challenge that, unless you can somehow show that it's more pleasurable to spend less time in the Oasis, which of course is going to depend on a variety of factors. Right? Think about Inception. Does it really matter whether or not Cobb or anybody else is stuck in a dream? Bentham would say, not really. Right? All that really matters is whether or not their experiences are pleasurable, right? And whether or not they're more pleasurable than they would be in other sorts of situations. And here again, we can think about what's going on for the individual, right? Or we can think about what's going on for the community at large. Bentham is not, you know, sort of self-centered. I'll put it that way. Right? He doesn't think it's only, you know, we should only look out for ourselves and only think about ourselves. Rather, he thinks it's really about the community at large. You know, other people and their happiness do matter. This is why it's you know, the greatest happiness principle. But even here, we can then introduce these questions about, well, you know, if somebody does choose to get stuck in a dream or something like that, how bad is that for other people? Right? Will they wake up at some point, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're thinking about this general question, value and reality, for Bentham, reality has no value in and of itself. All that has value are pleasurable experiences, and given that it's only our pleasurable experiences that matter, their causes don't matter, at least, right, insofar as those causes themselves are something other than the actual experiences we have. So the causes do matter if they end up producing more pain than pleasure over time. So if we think about something like, you know, like alcohol or drug use, right? Or, and then we can come back to Ready Player One here. If people spend all their time in the Oasis, so much so they've just given up on the real world, and the real world deteriorates and gets worse and worse and worse, if over time that means there's going to be more pain than pleasure, or say, you know, chronic drug or alcohol use over time in particular will create more pain than pleasure, right? Health problems that come up, you know, takes money to do so, if you make other people who care about you unhappy because of, you know, your continued use of these sorts of things, Bentham would say, now those things do matter. So we need to be thinking about pain and pleasure in rather broad terms over a span of time, and thinking about not only the individual, but the community at large. All right, so there's Bentham. Now let's take a look at Nozick. So Nozick, 20th century American philosopher. This reading comes out of his book, Anarchy, State, Utopia, which is a very well-known book. He wrote a number of other interesting essays and a few other books as well. Varied interests. He touched on a lot of different philosophical topics in his career. Now, this piece is probably one of Nozick's best sort of little thought experiments or ideas, the experience machine. So we get the experience machine thought experiment. So we'll talk about just what that is. And then ultimately what Nozick is trying to do in this piece is argue that we wouldn't plug into the experience machine. Why? Because we value more than mere mental states. So Nozick is, in a lot of ways, a very nice counterpoint to Bentham. So what is this experience machine? Now, Nozick puts it this way. He says, suppose there were an experience machine that would give you any experience you desired. Super duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a novel or making a friend or reading an interesting book. All the time you would be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Right? We get to choose what kinds of experiences we're going to have, and we're supposed to ignore technical questions like who's going to fix the machines and so on. So when phrased that way, and think about the timeline here again, 1974, right? We don't get the Matrix until 99. What he just described sounds like a pretty decent description of, well, the Matrix in particular, right? You're floating in some kind of tank, right, with electrodes attached to your brain. They make you think and feel you're doing certain things when really you're just in the tank. Something similar, not quite as similar, going on in both Inception and Ready Player One as well, right? You plug into this thing, you then have certain sorts of experiences. Now, of course, in Ready Player One, the people who are having those experiences are aware of the fact that they are just experiences. They're in some kind of virtual reality. In Inception, it may or may not be the case that they know whether or not the experiences are real. In the Matrix, generally speaking, people don't realize those experiences are simulated. Though, of course, we've got the exceptions like Neo and Trinity and Morpheus and so on, who are aware of the fact that they're plugging back into the Matrix and having simulated experiences. So this is basically the idea, right? We plug into the experience machine, we get to pick the experiences we want to have, and we won't know that that our experiences aren't veridical. We won't realize that they aren't real. We'll think we're in reality as we're in the machine. Now, and Nozick also allows, so he allows for sort of a couple different variations of this, that we can exit the machine intervals. He says, maybe you can come out every couple of years, or a couple of months, or whatever, and choose your next experiences. So you can sort of pre-program what's going to happen to you, right? Choosing ahead of time what's going to occur. But then he also asks, right, should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life's experiences? So here again, think about, and if you want to engage with the experience machine, think about the version of it you want to deal with. We could plug into the machine for life, say, and we could presumably do that without coming back out. Right? We could just plug ourselves into the machine for the rest of our entire lives, pick what our experiences are going to be, and we could fill in more details here. We could pick them broadly, right, or very particular. So, we could perhaps pick from broad categories of experiences, right? Oh, I want to be a secret agent or a famous novelist or whatever, right? Or, famous actress or something. Or we could pick it more narrowly, right? I want to be a famous novelist and I want to write a book on this subject or whatever, right? I want to win this particular award on this particular year or something like that. Now, of course, when we're in the machine, we're not going to realize that we're in the machine, right? We're going to think that the experiences we're having are accurately reflecting the world around us. So Nozick asks, should we plug into this machine? And then he asks, ironically, right? So he poses a lot of rhetorical questions. This one isn't a rhetorical question, but he, as a way of sort of playing around with ideas, he poses rhetorical questions. So don't emulate Nozick that way, at least not in writing for me, though I do quite enjoy the way Nozick goes about it, in part because when he asks rhetorical questions, there's a fair bit of the time where the answer actually is not clear, right? He's posing them rhetorically in one sense, but then he's also in some ways, right? The line between a rhetorical and a genuine question in Nozick is sort of an interesting line to draw. Sometimes he's pretty clearly trying to make a point with the questions. Other times they seem legitimate questions. So he asks ironically, after asking this question, what else can matter to us other than how our lives feel from the inside? Now that is a dig, right, at a mental state theorist of value like Bentham. So Bentham, given that all he cares about is the quality of the mental state, right? All that matters is pleasurable experience. Doesn't really matter what the cause is. Bentham should say yes. If Bentham's confronted with the experience machine and plugging into that machine and picking your life experiences results in more pleasurable experiences than not plugging in, and assuming reality doesn't, go down the tubes, so to speak, because everybody's plugging in, and of course Nozick says, let's just set that aside for now, then Bentham would say, well, yeah, I guess we should all plug in. If we have a situation like the Matrix, where we have machines that are going to do everything for us and sort of take care of the world, so nobody has to really do anything anymore. If we can then plug in and pick pleasurable experiences for our entire life, that's what we should do. But Nozick thinks this is wrong. Right? Nozick thinks we value things other than just our experiences. It's not just our mental states that matter. It's not just that the feeling of pleasure or the feeling of pain that matters when we're thinking in terms of value. There's more than that. Nozick points us to some suggestions. He doesn't fully flesh them out, so really I think he's worth reading to help stimulate your thinking, though he's not giving you decisive answers here. So he gives us a few thoughts. First, we want to do certain things, not just have the experience of doing them. So for instance, in my video yesterday, I talked about, if we've got really good virtual reality, if you can have a simulated experience that feels completely real, why not have a simulated experience of skydiving rather than actually go skydiving? Right? Well, one response, which is really what Nozick's getting here, because some of us actually want to go skydiving. We don't just want the experience of going skydiving, we actually want to go skydiving. Right? I'm still not sure I do, but right? This is one response. It's not just the experience that matters, it's actually doing the thing. Okay? We also want to be a certain way, to be a certain sort of person. Someone floating in a tank is an indeterminate blob, Nozick tells us. Here again, there's that interesting line from Ready Player One that I mentioned near the start when Wade is just sort of explaining what's going on. People go to the oasis for what they can do, but they stay there for who they can be. Right? They can be whoever they want. Nozick says, no, right? You aren't really any particular sort of person in the oasis or floating in the tank, right? Really, who you are is a function of what you do in reality, right? And so if you're just in the simulated environment all the time, you're in that virtual existence, you aren't really anything. Now, I think there are some interesting dimensions to push back on this here, right? Think about the Matrix. All the people in the Matrix are, indeterminate blobs floating in a tank, but they have experiences, they make choices, they do things in the Matrix. Right? When Neo comes out of the Matrix, even though he hasn't used his body before, right, he's still a particular person. He's Thomas Anderson, he's made choices, he's done things to get where he is. So I think there's some interesting room to push back on the second point here of Nozick's, but of course there's also room to support it. Really, all those people just floating in the tanks really are indeterminate blobs, in part because what we actually do, and not just our mental experiences of things, really do matter. Third, plugging into an experience machine limits us to a man-made reality, to a world no deeper or more important than that which people can construct. So here, there is, what Nozick's trying to point to is, it might be an assumption, maybe it's not an assumption, maybe it's view, or different term might be appropriate here, that reality that transcends our control, our ability to produce, has a value in and of itself. The world, the universe that exists around us that really escapes our control, that goes beyond what we can put limits and boundaries on, itself is something valuable. And that being in touch with that matters. Now, in addition to thinking that we wouldn't just plug into the experience machine, Nozick also brings up a couple of other ideas, a transformation machine, a results machine. And he thinks we wouldn't plug into these either. So the transformation machine lets you turn yourself into a different sort of person, right? So presumably, he doesn't quite give us all the details, but presumably change your physical appearance, say, right? Your height or weight, fitness level, right? Maybe hair, who knows? So he thinks we wouldn't want to step into that to just change who we are, though I'm just going to throw out here, what about cosmetic surgery? Right? People do take steps, not even cosmetic surgery, right? But just the steps people take to change at least how they appear, the different clothes we wear, how we style our hair, and et cetera. We do things to change our appearance. We do transform who we are. And he says, well, wouldn't just take a transformation machine. Well, here again, think about, Ready Player One. Think about the Oasis. People go in there and they can change who they are, just, click a few buttons or whatever, change their hairstyle, et cetera, et cetera. And we see, Wade, Parsifal do this. Some of the other characters do this as well. So I think, again, interesting question. Nozick saying, oh, we wouldn't do this. Is he right? Right? He's just asserting it. Right? He's just saying, oh, we wouldn't do this. Is he projecting? Is he really saying, I wouldn't do this, so I assume you wouldn't either? He doesn't give us any empirical evidence. This is something we're going to come back to with our, not the piece Wednesday, tomorrow, piece Thursday, the last piece, the Debregard piece. The results machine just changes reality for us. So, say I want to go out and weed my garden, pull out all the weeds and everything, do some gardening. I could just hit the results machine and say, okay, go, get the garden weeded. I just want it done, right? I don't actually want to go through the process. It would just do it. And he says, oh, we wouldn't do that either. I don't know, right? We invent a lot of technical tools to change reality for us without us having to put the effort in. But really what he's trying to get to here is that we care about more than just results. We care more about than just who we are or how we appear. We care more about just our experiences. So he suggests this. He's not quite asserting it, but he is certainly putting it out there. Perhaps what we desire is to live, an active verb, ourselves, in contact with reality. And this machines cannot do for us. Right? So Nozick doesn't quite hammer this down. He doesn't say, okay, here's exactly what you should believe. What he is trying to show us, though, like the ultimate conclusion he's trying to give, is that a conclusion like Bentham's, the tacit conclusion that I'm, in some sense, reading into Bentham, but I do think is really there, is that we value more than just our experiences. Bentham's view, his psychological and ethical hedonism really support the view that all that really matters are experiences. All that, when we're thinking about what's valuable, all that's really valuable is pain and pleasure. And pain and pleasure can only exist within experiences. So it's only experiences that matter, not what causes them. But Nozick is pressing directly against that, saying it's not just experiences we care about. It's experiences produced in the right kind of way, right? What the suggestion he has here, perhaps what we desire is to live ourselves in contact with reality. That would help explain why we wouldn't want to, say, plug ourselves into an experience machine, or even use a transformation or results machine. It's not just transforming your body in a certain way. It's having the right causal process to do it, right? It's putting in the work. It's not just getting the results. It's going through the right kind of process, doing the right sorts of things to get them. It's not just having the experience that matters. It's having the experience produced in the right way, right? If I go skydiving and I'm just in a virtual reality thing, right? So I just have the experience of it. Well, all I'm getting is a simulated skydive, not the real thing. My experience of the wind whooshing through my hair and, looking down from thousands of feet and probably freaking out a fair bit. You know, odds are if I'm having that simulated experience, I'm really not going to have the same experience I do as I would if I was really skydiving. At least not if I, you know that I'm having merely a simulated experience. But even if I'm plugged into the experience machine, I think the experience is real while I'm having it, which is not to say that I won't realize after I come out of the machine that was fake. Nozick says that still doesn't quite get us what we want, right? We value more than experiences. It's having experiences caused in the right sort of way that seems to matter to us, right? We value more than just our experiences. We value more than just pain and pleasure. Okay, that's really it for these two readings. I'll wrap it up here. Tomorrow we're going to take a look at the Cowell piece, Jason Cowell, who the piece, The Experience Machine and Mental State Theories of Well-Being, is going to consider the subjection of Nozick's to mental state theories like Bentham's and try to do something with it. He's going to try to answer this kind of objection and think a little bit more about what Nozick's saying. So we're going to see that. And then we're going to take a look at the Dabergard piece on Thursday. And Dabergard introduces at least some psychological evidence from actual, actually asking people about their opinions and views on things. Really adding to this subject matter, is all that matters our experiences, or do people actually care about more than just their experiences? As I mentioned, Nozick seems to really be doing this from the armchair and just sort of projecting, right? Well, people wouldn't do this. Dabergard saying, well, wouldn't they? Let's ask them. And of course, I'll just mention here, it's always one thing to ask somebody in a survey or something, or sort of hypothetically, right? If I ask you, would you plug into the experience machine? You say, oh, yes or no. And you might be doing it actually quite thoughtfully. But if we actually had one, and it was actually right here, we might come to reflect more seriously on our choices before making them. So anyway, we'll get around to those next two pieces the next couple of days, which will help add to our thinking, add to our material for contemplating what's going on in these subjects, what's going on in these films, what is this issue, and what are the relevant points to be brought up in it. That's all for today. You'll see me again tomorrow. Until then, I hope you're well. Have a great night.